Most people would have ignored it. An old woman sitting alone in a corner booth, her hand drifting absently to her cheekbone, her eyes darting toward the entrance every time the door opened. Most people would have convinced themselves it wasn't their business, that they were imagining things, that getting involved only brought trouble. But Marcus Grave Holloway had spent too many years reading fear on people's faces to miss it when it was sitting 3 feet away from him in a roadside diner outside Bakersfield, California, on a Tuesday night that was about to turn into something none of them would forget. What started as a quiet meal would end with federal agents surrounding a suburban house, a decades-old secret finally dragged into daylight, and an elderly woman finding the courage she thought had died 40 years earlier. But first, there was just the bruise, the glances, and a biker who refused to look away. The Red Arrow Diner sat at the junction where Highway 58 split toward the oil fields, its neon sign buzzing weakly against the twilight sky. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and fried onions hung in the air while a handful of truckers hunched over plates at the counter, and a waitress named Donna moved between tables with the tired efficiency of someone who'd worked the evening shift for 20 years. Marcus had stopped for coffee and a burger after riding north from Tehachapi, his leather vest still damp from an afternoon rain and his shoulders aching from 8 hours on the road. He was a massive man, 6'4" with a gray-streaked beard and hands scarred from decades of mechanical work and harder choices. The patch on his back marked him as a full member of the Desert Reapers Motorcycle Club, and most people gave him a wide berth without even realizing they were doing it. He sat alone in a booth near the window, his back to the wall out of habit, watching the highway roll past while he waited for his food. That's when he noticed her. She was in the booth directly behind him, visible in the reflection of the window glass. A small woman, maybe 75, with white hair pinned back neatly, and a floral blouse buttoned to her collar despite the warmth of the diner. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, but every 30 seconds or so, her right hand would drift upward and touch her left cheekbone with a delicate, almost unconscious gesture. Marcus shifted slightly to get a better angle in the glass. The light caught her face, and that's when he saw it. A dark purple bruise spreading from her cheekbone to her temple, the kind that came from a closed fist, not a fall. His jaw tightened. The woman's gaze flicked toward the diner entrance, then back to her untouched water glass, then to the entrance again. Her breathing was shallow, visible even from across the aisle. She was waiting for someone, and she was terrified. Marcus turned his head slowly, abandoning the pretense of the window reflection, and looked at her directly. Up close, he could see how carefully she tried to cover the bruise with makeup that didn't quite match her skin tone. Could see the faint tremor in her hands. Could see the way her whole body went rigid every time a car passed outside. Donna appeared with Marcus's burger, setting it down with a clatter. "Anything else, hon?" "Who's that?" Marcus asked quietly, nodding toward the woman. Donna glanced over and lowered her voice. "Mrs. Calloway. Helen. Comes in here once a week, orders hot water, and sits for an hour. Never eats. Just sits." She paused, her expression darkening. "Started showing up with bruises about 6 months ago. You ever ask her about them?" "Tried once. She said she fell." Donna's tone made it clear what she thought of that explanation. "But her son picks her up every time, and the way she looks at him." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Anyway, not much I can do." She walked away before Marcus could respond, but the words had already settled like stones in his chest. Her son picks her up. Marcus looked back at Helen Calloway. She was touching the bruise again, her fingers hovering over the swollen skin as if testing how much it hurt. Then her eyes went to the door, and this time they stayed there, and Marcus saw her entire body tense like a rabbit catching a predator's scent. Headlights swept across the diner windows. A gray sedan pulled into the parking lot and stopped under the buzzing neon sign. The engine shut off. A man stepped out, mid-40s, medium build, wearing khakis and a collared shirt that looked aggressively normal. He adjusted his glasses and walked toward the diner entrance with the confident stride of someone who owned every room he entered. Helen's hand dropped to her lap. Her shoulders curled inward. The fear that had been simmering in her expression crystallized into something sharper. The door chimed as the man walked in, and his eyes found Helen immediately. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying an edge of impatience wrapped in forced warmth. "You ready? We need to get home." Helen stood slowly, gathering a small purse with shaking hands. Yes, David. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you wait. You never do. David's smile didn't reach his eyes. He glanced around the diner, his gaze passing over Marcus without interest. Just another biker in a roadside dive. Helen moved toward him, each step careful and measured. And as she passed Marcus's booth, her eyes met his for a split second, a silent, desperate plea that hit him like a freight train. Then she was walking out the door, her son's hand firm on her elbow, guiding her toward the gray sedan, while Marcus sat frozen in his seat. Every instinct he'd honed over 53 years of life screaming that he was about to watch something terrible disappear into the night. He looked down at his burger, then at the door, then at Donna, who was staring after Helen with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a grim line. Marcus pushed the plate aside and stood up. Because some things, once you see them, you can't unsee. And some people, once you recognize the fear in their eyes, you can't just let walk away. Marcus was through the diner door before he'd fully decided what he was doing, his boots hitting the gravel parking lot as the gray sedan's taillights flared red. David Calloway had just opened the passenger door for his mother, his hand still gripping her elbow with the kind of pressure that looked helpful from a distance, but wasn't. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the lot without needing to be loud. David turned, irritation flickering across his face as he took in the 6'4" biker walking toward him. Helen's eyes widened, something between hope and terror crossing her expression. "Can I help you?" David asked, his tone polite but clipped. Marcus stopped a few feet away, making sure his body language stayed calm despite the anger building in his chest. "Just wanted to make sure the lady's all right. Noticed she seemed a little shaken up in there." "My mother's fine." David's smile tightened. "She gets confused sometimes. Forgetful. It's part of getting older." He said it like he was explaining something to a child. "I'm not confused," Helen said quietly. The words were so soft Marcus almost missed them. But David heard them, and his grip on her elbow tightened enough that she flinched. "Mom, don't be difficult. We've talked about this." David's voice had gone harder, the veneer of patience cracking. He turned back to Marcus. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter. We need to get home." Marcus didn't move. He looked at Helen directly. "Ma'am, are you safe?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Her mouth opened, then closed. Years of fear and conditioning and beaten down hope warred across her face. David's hand was still locked around her arm, a silent reminder of what happened when she spoke out of turn. "She's safe," David answered for her. "Now if you'll excuse us, I was asking her." Marcus's tone didn't change, but something in his eyes did. The kind of shift that made men twice David's size reconsider their choices. David bristled. "Listen, I don't know what you think is happening here, but I'm taking my mother home. If you don't step aside, I'll call the police and report you for harassment." "Good," Marcus said. "Call them. I'll wait." The bluff landed perfectly. David's hand went to his pocket where his phone presumably was, but he didn't pull it out. Because men who hurt people in private rarely want police showing up with questions. The silence stretched, tension coiling tighter. Then Helen spoke again, louder this time. "I want to stay here." David's face went red. "Mom, I want to stay here," she repeated, her voice shaking but firm. "I don't want to go home with you tonight." Something dangerous flashed in David's eyes. "You're being ridiculous. You need your medication. Your bed. You can't just—" "The lady said she wants to stay." Marcus took one step closer, and suddenly the size difference between him and David felt much more significant. "So she's staying." David's jaw worked, fury and calculation fighting for control. Finally, he released Helen's arm and held up both hands in a gesture of false surrender. "Fine. Fine. Stay. But don't come crying to me when you realize you're making a mistake." He looked at Marcus with pure contempt. "You have no idea what you're getting involved in." He climbed into the sedan and peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind his tires. Helen stood in the empty space he'd left, swaying slightly, as if the strings that had been holding her upright had suddenly been cut. Marcus caught her elbow, gently, and guided her back toward the diner. "Let's get you inside," he said quietly. Donna had watched the whole exchange through the window, and she already had a fresh cup of coffee and a blanket waiting when they walked back in. Helen sank into the booth, trembling, and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders despite the warmth of the room. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble. You didn't cause anything, Marcus said, sliding into the seat across from her. How long has this been going on? Helen's hand drifted to her bruise again, then stopped as if she'd just realized what she was doing. A long time. Years. Since my husband died and I moved in with David. He was so kind at first. Helpful. But then, she trailed off, staring at her coffee. He controls everything. My money, my phone, when I leave the house. And when I don't do what he wants, or when I ask too many questions. She gestured vaguely at her face. Marcus felt a cold anger settle in his gut. Why didn't you tell anyone? Who would believe me? Helen's laugh was bitter. David's a respected accountant. He volunteers at church. Everyone thinks he's a wonderful son taking care of his elderly mother. And I'm just an old woman with a bad memory. She paused. That's what he tells people. That I have dementia. That I make things up. Do you? No. The word came out fierce and certain. I know exactly what's happening to me. Donna brought over a phone. You need to call someone, Helen. Police, family, somebody. Helen shook her head rapidly. I can't. David has connections. Last time I tried to tell someone, he convinced them I was having delusions. I ended up in a psychiatric evaluation for 3 days. Her eyes filled with tears. He'll do it again. He'll lock me away somewhere, and no one will ever believe me. Marcus leaned back, thinking. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with fists or intimidation. This was deeper, more twisted. It required something else. What if someone believed you who David couldn't dismiss? He asked slowly. Someone with authority. Helen looked up at him, confused. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he wanted. Angela Chun, a social worker he'd worked with years ago when the Reapers had helped shut down a drug house near a school. She owed him a favor. More importantly, she had connections to elder abuse task forces and wasn't afraid to go up against men like David Calloway. I know someone, Marcus said. And if your son thinks a biker's scary, wait until he meets a social worker with a court order. For the first time since he'd noticed her in the diner, Helen Calloway smiled. Angela Chin arrived at the Red Arrow Diner at 9:47 p.m., carrying a leather briefcase and an expression that had made grown men confess to things they'd sworn they'd never admit. She was barely 5 feet tall, in her late 40s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of quiet authority that filled a room more effectively than any amount of volume. Marcus met her at the door and walked her to the booth where Helen sat wrapped in Donna's blanket, looking smaller and more fragile now that the adrenaline of confrontation had faded. But when Angela sat down across from her and introduced herself, Helen's spine straightened slightly. Mrs. Calloway, Angela said gently. Marcus told me some of what's happening, but I need to hear it from you. Everything. Can you do that? And Helen did. The story came out in pieces at first, then in a steady stream. How David had convinced her to sell her house and move in with him after her husband died, promising it would be easier, safer. How he'd slowly taken control of her bank accounts to help with the bills. How the first time he'd grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises, he'd apologized with tears in his eyes and sworn it would never happen again. How it had happened again, and again, and again. How the bruises became slaps. How the slaps became worse. How he'd isolated her from the few friends she had left, monitoring her phone calls, her mail, her weekly trip to this diner that was the only hour of freedom she had anymore. Angela took notes without interrupting, her expression never changing, but Marcus saw her knuckles whiten around her pen. When Helen finished, her voice hoarse from talking, Angela reached across the table and placed her hand over the old woman's trembling fingers. You're not going back to that house tonight, Angela said firmly. I'm going to make some calls, and by tomorrow morning, we're going to have a protective order and a full investigation opened. But right now, we need to get you somewhere safe. Where? Helen's voice cracked. He'll find me. He always knows where I am. Not this time. Angela was already dialing. I work with a shelter that specializes in elder abuse cases. It's confidential, protected, and they have legal advocates who do this for a living. She paused as someone answered on the other end, then stepped away to speak quietly into the phone. Marcus stayed with Helen. You did the right thing, he said. Telling me. It's over now. Is it? Helen looked at him with eyes that had seen too many promises broken. David won't just let this go. He'll fight. He'll lie. He's very good at lying. Then we'll be better at telling the truth. Marcus leaned forward. And you won't be alone. I'll make sure of that. Angela returned, her expression satisfied. They're expecting you. I'm going to drive you there myself right now. We'll collect some of your things from David's house tomorrow with a police escort. The relief that washed over Helen's face was almost painful to witness. She stood shakily, still clutching the blanket, and looked at Marcus with tears streaming down her cheeks. Why did you help me? You don't even know me. Marcus thought about his own mother, who died when he was 17. Thought about how many times she'd covered bruises with makeup and long sleeves. How many times she'd lied about falling or being clumsy. How many times he'd been too young and powerless to stop it. How he'd sworn, standing over her grave, that he'd never let fear win again if he could help it. Because you asked, he said simply. You didn't say the words out loud, but you asked. And I heard you. Helen reached out and squeezed his scarred hand with surprising strength, then followed Angela out into the night toward a car that would take her somewhere David couldn't reach. Donna watched them go, then turned to Marcus. Your burger's cold. Want me to make you a fresh one? Yeah, Marcus said, settling back into his booth. That'd be good. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Turned out, once one person started asking questions about David Calloway, others came forward. Neighbors who'd heard raised voices. A former co-worker who'd witnessed him berating his mother in public. Bank records showing systematic financial exploitation. Medical records documenting injuries that Helen had been too frightened to report. Within a week, David was arrested on charges of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and assault. Angela told Marcus later that he'd tried to play the victim, claiming his mother was mentally ill and manipulative, but the evidence was overwhelming. The Bruises told their own story in photographs. The bank statements didn't lie, and Helen, with an advocate beside her and freedom in her voice, testified with a clarity that destroyed every lie David had built. 3 months later, Marcus got a call from Angela. Thought you'd want to know? David took a plea deal. 5 years, restitution, permanent restraining order. Helen gets her money back and full control of her life. How is she? Strong. She moved into a senior living community last month. Independent living, her own apartment. She joined a book club. Angela paused. She asked about you. Wanted me to tell you thank you. Said she thinks about that night every day and still can't believe someone actually stopped. After they hung up, Marcus sat on his bike outside the clubhouse and stared at the horizon where the sun was setting over the desert. He thought about all the roads he'd ridden, all the places he'd been, all the fights he'd walked into and out of. Thought about how easy it would have been to look away in that diner, to decide it wasn't his problem, to let Helen disappear into that sedan and tell himself there was nothing he could have done. But he hadn't looked away, and because of that, an old woman was free. His phone buzzed with a message from Angela. Helen wanted me to give you her new address. Says she makes terrible coffee, but if you're ever in Bakersfield, you're welcome to stop by and complain about it. Marcus smiled and saved the address. Maybe he would. Maybe next time he rolled through, he'd stop and have terrible coffee with a survivor who'd found her voice in the corner booth of a roadside diner. Because sometimes courage looked like a biker refusing to mind his own business. And sometimes freedom started with someone simply saying, I see you, and I'm not leaving. He kicked the engine to life, the rumble echoing across the desert, and rode toward the highway where the last light was fading and tomorrow was already waiting.